Good evening, Eynsham. This is the third of our Tiny Talks in the Tiny Talk Festival, which is just, I've just got so excited about it. It's absolutely brilliant. It's worth just having a bit of a remember about the vision for the Nature Recovery Network in Eynsham, because this feels like almost the essence of it, and it's about get together a bottom-up community of people who are either experts, enthusiasts in whatever role, and network of networks of people who are interested in nature recovery and maintaining the sort of mosaic of ecological habitats in our local area. And these tiny talks are kind of a soupçon of interest from the amazing experts and the amazing knowledge that we have in the village. And this evening we have Neil Clennell, who is a herpetologist, which is a study of amphibians and reptiles. I've just had to remind myself by looking it up on Google. And Neil's going to talk to us about the slow worm and slow worms. Neil's been in conservation biology for 20 years, since 6, I think, Neil. Including, rather intriguingly, early childhood in Bahamas, where you first got interested in reptiles. And interestingly, the first slow worms you found, you kept in a fish tank in your bedroom?
I certainly did, yeah. My mum wasn't very happy about that.
So it's obviously a long history and a lot of connection with slow worms. And Neil, it'd be really, really good fun to hear what you've got to say about them in a 20-minute slot, and then we'll have time for questions. If you do want to ask questions in the chat, then do so, and we'll try and direct them directly. And so Neil, tell us all.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Nikki, for the introduction. It's really nice to be part of this series of talks. I think it's such a good idea. I've sat in on the first two so far, and they've been very different talks, but both really, really interesting. So I'm pleased to be invited to do one, and I'm looking forward to hearing many of the rest of them. So as Nikki just said, reptiles have been a lifelong enthusiasm for me. It kind of began in childhood, and I was lucky enough to spend a bit of time in the Bahamas, where there were a fair amount of exotic reptiles, and you kind of took them for granted. And it was only when we moved back to Britain when I was 9 years old that you kind of didn't realise how seldom you saw reptiles until you saw one. So the first day I saw a grass snake, or the first great crested newt I caught, blew my mind. The fact that there were things like that in this little cold country was fascinating to me. And slow worms played a really big part of my childhood. I learned where to find them. I learned a lot about them, and as we said in the introduction, I just couldn't help keeping a few of them at home. Eventually I let them all go, and I learned a lot more about reptiles and their requirements. And eventually ended up doing some very specific herpetological jobs. But slow worms kind of have a soft spot for me, and because we did some surveys in the village this year and started to map their distribution, it seemed like a sensible topic for this evening, really. So if I can just share my screen, I've got a few slides to show you. Okay, so firstly, I'll give a really quick whistle-stop tour of the reptiles we've got in Britain, what makes the slow worm kind of unusual, and then I'll just say a little bit about its natural history and its biology, and maybe touch a little bit on why we surveyed them in the village this year. And if I manage to do all that in 15 or 20 minutes, I'll miss loads of stuff. So hopefully there'll be some questions about how they live their lives, and I'll do my best to answer them. So we have 6 terrestrial native species in Britain, 3 lizards and 3 snakes, which doesn't sound like very much, but when you think again that we are a small, tiny, temperate island stuck up in the North Sea somewhere, it's pretty impressive, really. And we've got some quite unusual ones. We've got some real rarities and some real special ones. So the 3 lizards, this one up here is called the common lizard. It's not a moniker I like, because a lot of our common species aren't very common anymore. This one, all the places I knew where I grew up, where I used to find this as a kid, I can't find them anymore. So they seem to be disappearing pretty quickly. Its more kind of accurate name is the viviparous lizard, because of the way that it gives it retains its eggs in its body until they hatch, and then passes them. So it looks like a live bearing animal, but it actually isn't. This one, very handsome creature, about twice the size of the common lizard. This is the sand lizard, real habitat specialist. So you only find this in areas where there's lots and lots of kind of bare, warm sand for them to burrow. So typically heathlands and typically places like the south coast. There's a colony up in the dune system in the Wirral, but you won't find one of those unless you go specifically looking for it, and it has the highest level of international protection anyway. So technically you're licensed to even touch one of these. And then the third one is, is the slow worm, the subject of tonight's little talk. And it's quite an unusual beast for all sorts of reasons. And it's also the one which is by far the most accommodating of people's modification of the environment. And if you know where to look and how to look, it's probably our most common reptile, really. And it finds its way happily right into sort of town centres and urban areas. So it's doing very well in the face of human modification of the environment. And then the other three species, again, three snakes. I won't say very much about these, apart from the fact that almost every time someone finds a slow worm in a garden or a park, they will swear that it's a snake, and they will usually say that it's an adder or possibly a grass snake. And over the years, I've had to investigate lots and lots of these, reports of snakes, and they almost always turn out to be slow worms. Very occasionally, a report of an adder turns out to be a grass snake. But most times you get to the bottom of it, it's a slow worm in the garden. So we've got the grass snake, which is the only snake you'll find in Oxfordshire, certainly around Eynsham anymore. Biggest snake, alert and active, so you usually see it as it's disappearing, but very handsome animals. You quite often see them in water because of their amphibian prey. So if you see a snake around here, or even a bit of a snake disappearing, that's what it is, absolutely no doubt about it. The adder is the other very well known and recognizable one with the characteristic zigzags. This is a snake which never really liked the kind of clay soil areas in Oxfordshire. So it used to exist upon the kind of sandy ridges of Frilford and Shotover until about the sort of early 80s. And then it started to disappear from those areas. And the last animal that I know of for certain disappeared from Oxfordshire about 4 years ago. So it's definitely functionally extinct, almost certainly totally extinct. And it doesn't do well with humans. So it's kind of being, driven away from central England. And then this one is kind of the holy grail of British reptiles, really unusual thing called the smooth snake. It's even rarer and even more difficult to find than the sand lizard. It's restricted to 3 counties only. And it only lives in very mature heathlands because it is a reptile specialist. So it quite happily eats adders and slow worms and small enough grass snakes. But it's a small snake. So the babies are so tiny, they kind of curl up on a 1p piece, and the only thing they'll eat is baby lizards. So unless you've got a huge supply of baby slow worms, baby common lizards, baby sand lizards, you just don't get anything. So it's very difficult to find. I've only found a handful in my time. This is me cheaply picking one up without a license. It's another species which technically you shouldn't be doing that, but obviously I'm a professional herpetologist and no one was looking. No, they're really handsome animals. Very rare to find them. Lots of people go out their way to try and fail. So those are our 6 reptile species. And then the one we were going to focus on tonight is the slow worm. So it's a really interesting animal, I think. Out of about 6,500 lizard species in the world, about 200 of them are the so-called snake lizards, ophidiosaurs, and they occupy about 3 or 4 different families. And out of those 200 or so, only about 30, 35 species are truly legless. So most of them have some sort of vestigial limb, usually the rear one, occasionally front and rear. And it's purely an adaptation to going back to a burrowing lifestyle. So if you decide that you're going to go back underground, then legs are generally a bit of a hindrance. So the slow worm's quite unusual. It's a rarity among lizards. So having one in Britain is pretty cool. And it's also one of those really truly legless animals. And it has lots of old archaic names, the blind worm, the blind snake. Of course, slow worm is the one that's really stuck. But it's an intriguing animal. For a long time, it's confused people as to whether it was a snake or a lizard or a worm. So it's clearly not a worm, and it's clearly not a blind worm, because it does have very small eyes. And the main diagnostic difference is if you x-ray one, you will see that a slow worm has a pretty much intact pelvic girdle. It also has fairly good kind of scapular remnants in there. So you can see signs of the scaffolding of having limbs in the past, but there's absolutely no external signs whatsoever. So, how would you tell this apart from a snake? Well, there are several ways. The most obvious one is the eye. So if you've got a slow worm in your hand for long enough and you watch, you'll see it blink every now and again. And there are no snakes which blink. Snakes have a clear scale called a brill, which covers the eye, which kind of gives them that 1,000-yard stare. But the slow worm is one of a good number of lizards that can actually blink. It also flicks its tongue like a snake does, but it does it in a very different way. So it has to open its mouth in order to flick its tongue. So every snake species has a little notch in the rostral scale here, which allows it to flick its tongue more frequently, and that's an adaptation to avoiding water loss. It's a different olfactory mechanism in this lizard than it is in all the snakes, but still they flick their tongue a lot, not as frequently as snakes, but they have to open their mouth to do it. And then the other thing it's really famous for, if you can see in this picture, this is one that's broken its tail off. So this is called autotomy, and it's basically a survival strategy. So the slow worm, like a number of other lizard families, have fracture planes between the vertebrae of the tail. So when the animal thinks its life is in danger, usually if it's been grasped by a predator, traditionally I guess birds of prey, badgers, more recently domestic cats are a big problem. But if it thinks its life's in danger, it can drop its tail. And it does this by effectively firing a nerve impulse, which contracts the cartilage between two vertebrae, and the tail drops off. And then the nerves in the shed piece of tail cause it to wildly thrash about, and it acts as a diversion for whatever is trying to eat it or molest it. And it gives the animal a chance to get away. It's quite interesting with slow worms. I mean, if you if you roughly handle common lizards or even sand lizards, should you get the opportunity, they shed their tails pretty easily. It doesn't take much to provoke them. I've seen slow worms very roughly handled by children so many times, and they hardly ever drop their tails. I've only seen it a few times through rough human handling. However, more than half of the slow worms you find out and about tend to have regrown tail stumps. So because the animal is shedding the vertebrae in the tail, it can't regrow the bones, so it basically heals and it regrows a bit of cartilage, and you just get a little pointy stump. And this is really common. And what it is that attacks slow worms with that kind of ferocity that makes them drop the tails so frequently when humans don't, I don't know. It must be a response to badgers or birds or cats, but it's been a bit of an enigma for me that I very rarely see them do it, but you often find them that have actually shed tails. The other thing, if you handle these animals very often and you also handle snakes, you notice that they're much less flexible. So it's a much kind of rigid body compared to the kind of really supine body of the snake. And that's the combination of having less ribs, but also the slow worm shares a feature with the crocodilians of all things. So beneath every individual scale, there's a little tiny bony plate called an osteoderm. All crocodilians have them, a good number of lizards have them. And it has a kind of twin function. So it's partly for making the animal a bit more, impregnable, if you like. It adds something in terms of defense, but it's also a very handy metabolic calcium store. But it gives them this kind of much more rigid feel. So those are effectively the ways that you know that this is a lizard and not a snake. And then, in terms of lifestyle, sexing them is usually pretty easy. It's very difficult when they're immature, but as they mature, usually they reach sexual maturity at maybe 3 years or so. And this one is a male, a very typical male. So as they reach maturity, the males kind of fade all over and become a kind of unicolor. It's very variable. They can be kind of browny, grey. I've seen salmony pink ones. They can be almost sort of steely blue. So they are quite variable in colour, but they tend to be more or less uniform. This is an almost textbook female, very, very typical. So goldy bronze dorsum, but a very different contrasting flank. You see the male, same, female has these kind of chocolate sides, and she's retained this pencil thin vertebral stripe all the way down the back. So normally you'd say to people, if it's mature and it's unicolor and there's no stripe, it's a male. If it's got chocolate flanks and it's got a stripe, it's a female. Some females lose the vertebral stripe, like this one. This is where it starts to get more confusing. because you will often find females that have lost the stripe over time, but there will always be this contrast in the flanks here. And as the more you see, there are other differences. Once they're mature, the sort of head shape and morphology is quite characteristic. So is the kind of heft of the body of mature males. And here you can see a female with newborns. So this gives you an idea of the size of them. They're pretty small worm-like things, and they're always goldy coppery colour with a strong vertical stripe and very strong chocolate flanks. So until they reach maturity, it's pretty hard to tell what they are. As they mature, the flanks start to fade in males, and the females tend to stay closer to that neonatal pattern. And then this one, I mean, this is a curiosity that I've seen a fair few. It's pretty rare. I have seen a good number of these, but only because I've seen thousands and thousands of slow worms through the course of work and being a child that like this sort of stuff. But every now and again, you will find really big mature males that have azure blue scales. If you read really old literature, this was considered a different species. So people used to talk about the really rare blue spotted slow worm, but it seems to be a function of great age in males. So you only ever find blue spotted males, and they're always big, chunky, scarred old animals. It's quite impressive to see. Most times I've seen it have been in really pristine reptile habitats where you do get these very old animals in big populations, but much less often in kind of suburban situations or suboptimal habitat areas. But where they do get allowed to live to ripe old ages, it's not uncommon to find these blue spotted ones. And when I say ripe old ages, the current record for a slow worm was still 54 years old. So there was an animal in the Steinhardt Aquarium in the late 1800s, which is now Copenhagen Zoo. But it lived to be 54 years old, and it was a full-grown adult when they got it. So potentially, these things can live, almost human lifespans if they're left to their own devices. And then where do you find them? Slow worms have the most Catholic habitat taste of all our reptiles. So they are obviously most at home in this kind of absolute gold standard style reptile habitat. So this is your kind of Thomas Hardy, lowland heath, lots and lots of mature heather, lots of open basking positions. All of our reptiles favour this kind of habitat given the choice, and a couple of them are restricted to it. They can't cope elsewhere. Slow worms, much more amenable to different types of habitats. So this kind of brownfield, rough grassland, tatty areas with ragwort, perfect for them. This kind of small microhabitat gives them lots of food options and lots of basking opportunities. Woodland rides, you often find them. Allotments, they love allotments, untidy allotments, and they will also, as we'll see briefly in a moment, are quite happy in suburban areas and village centres and town centres. So as long as there's cover, as long as there's a food supply, and as long as they've got a chance from cats or little boys collecting them or whatever, they've got a fairly good chance of living their lives quite unnoticed. And then how do you find them? There are a number of techniques for finding reptiles. You can walk along and spot them. Really difficult with a cryptic animal like a slow worm. You do sometimes see them out basking, but I've only seen maybe 10 or so in all the years I've kind of worked in the kind of places where these animals live, because they are, they're called subfossorial animals. So they're not truly fossorial. They're not out and out burrowers, but they do live in kind of top layers of soil, and they really like living under objects. So for slow worms in particular, as well as lots of other reptiles, using artificial refuges is a really good way to find them. Slow worms, again, not too fussed whether you use things like corrugated tin or roofing felts. This one's under carpet tile, which a lot of animals won't go near. But if you want to survey snakes, then really you need to be using this kind of corrugated tin. And the advantage that these refuges give is that they're heavy. The animal feels like it's underground, it's dark, but also at the beginning and ends of the year when the temperatures are not quite at their optimal level, objects like this absorb heat, and it gives them that kind of thermal advantage for a short part of the day. You can also find, far less reliable is seeing slough skin. So sometimes you'll find a snake skin. Slow worms tend to budge theirs up. It's almost like a degloving effect. So you don't get this long, nice skin stretched out amongst the vegetation like you would with a snake. You just get this little scrunched up kind of ball of skin. But it's only one cell thick. It's not very, it breaks down pretty quickly. So it's interesting to know that you've got animals around if you find their skins, but it's really corroborating evidence rather than something you should rely on. And then radio telemetry, I've never used it on slow worms. I've only used it on adders personally. Slow worms are a bit little to attach a transponder to, and it's probably not worth it. They're so sedentary, they spend so much time in the same place that it's not something you would consider, but it is a tool, particularly with some of the other species. And then this is Eynsham. So, you know, we started surveying the slow worm population in the village because Katrina applied for a grant from the Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment. She was ultimately successful, but it was to do with grassland manipulation. And, you know, one of the sites is St Leonard's Churchyard, and it looked to me like a pretty reptile-y place. So we did a little survey because they are protected. The habitats aren't protected, but the animal itself is. So if you go in and start injuring them, even if you didn't know they were there, your behaviour is considered reckless under the NRN Act. So you need to do what you can to find out what animals you've got there and then mitigate accordingly. And we found, sure enough, there were slow worms there. So this is a young male in the churchyard. And then the people over at Peace Oak got interested. So from doing one survey, we looked at the allotments over there, and this is one of last year's newborns that was found there. So it's quite interesting to do with a bit of training and a bit of thought. It's not difficult to set sites up. There's nothing illegal about going along and surveying these animals. And, you know, this is, you know, there's the church. The other side of this is the village square. This is right in the heart of the village. You know, these are protected, unusual reptiles, and they're going about their business quite happily amongst the rest of our activities. And if we get the opportunity to interest more people and expand these surveys, you'll be surprised where they'll turn up. You know, if you've got a big, rough garden, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. You'll have slow worms there. Very good survivors, and it's their secrecy, which is their advantage, really. And then the very final thing I will say, you know, given the context of the Nature Recovery Network and the talks we've had before and the webinars previously, there are lots of really simple interventions that you can do to encourage reptiles, not just slow worms, but you know, around here we'll definitely have grass snakes about, slow worms. I've heard reports of common lizards, but I've yet to verify them. You know, I don't think they're doing particularly well. But as long as you've got animals nearby to inoculate habitat you create, then doing anything like this is going to be a really good idea. So, you know, encouraging rank, rough grasslands that's not particularly well managed. Brash piles are good for cover and encouraging invertebrates. Ponds, great for a million reasons, but also because they attract amphibians, which in turn attracts grass snakes. And then compost heaps, you know, whether these are domestic ones or stable yards, or even, you know, the local council leaving its grass clippings in a particular place. Once you get these really big established compost heaps, they are, you know, an absolute magnet for grass snakes. Once upon a time, grass snakes profited from nobody clearing up floodwater debris, nobody clearing up rotting trees in woodlands. Of course, now that we do, they've moved into compost heaps, and they use them because they allow them to incubate their eggs at a warmer temperature than the environmental one. So if you're really lucky, you might see something like this. This is just tons of female grass snakes congregating to lay eggs under a piece of old carpet in a compost heap. So all of these things are so easy to do, and will definitely enhance, you know, the local environment for reptiles. So I think I've probably done slightly over 20 minutes, but
Perfect.
Slow worms. So thank you for your kind attention, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that there are.
Fantastic. Thank you. We've got a little bit of feedback there. That's so interesting. We've got a couple of questions. I've got one question. Can I get mine in first? I think it's about slow worms, but I think I have had a grass snake in my garden, which might indicate how untidy my garden is. But I'm quite interested to know how what their sort of range is. So that's one question. What's their sort of territory, if you like? And Renee was asking which parts of the UK you most likely to see adders. So that's the two questions to start us off on.
Okay, both really good questions. Grass snakes are the most rangy and most unfaithful animals in terms of a home range. So at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have that smooth snake that we looked at, very small, very sedentary. It's been proven through telemetry that most of them live their life in a piece of heathland about the size of a tennis court. So they don't go anywhere or do anything. Adders kind of in the middle. Males tend to roam for several kilometres after hibernation periods. I know from some of the work that I did that females will roam a little bit. Occasional females will spend 2 years under the same bramble bush without moving. Grass snakes have been tracked and have quite big home ranges. You know, in the course of a year, about 10 square kilometres is fairly average for a grass snake, and they will at certain times of the year cover a couple of kilometres a day. So they're quite rangy animals. They tend not to frequent the same places over and over unless it's those egg-laying sites that we looked at. So if you have a good one, the animals learn where it is, and many females will go back year after year. They will also be faithful to very good amphibian populations, but they only feed 4 or 5 times a year anyway. So it's very unusual to encounter the same snake in the same place twice, whereas, you know, something like an adder is totally different. They're very faithful to good basking spots, good hunting areas. And when you kind of study them, you quickly learn individuals by their pattern, and you'll see the same snakes in the same place day after day after day. So totally different approach to, you know, their habitat usage, but grass snakes, pretty big ranges. Yeah. And then adders, I mean, as I said, they're being forced out really of central English counties. So it's almost like they're just disappearing from central England and restricting themselves to the coasts. So they're still doing quite well. It's a very cold tolerant snake. So they're still happy enough in Scotland and the northern uplands. Some of the big coastal areas that are less fragmented, you know, particularly the southwest and the Welsh coast, are still pretty good haunts for adders. But they don't seem to do very well alongside people. They're quite sensitive to habitat disturbance, but they're also very sensitive to the old nasties like habitat fragmentation. And of course, it's a venomous snake. It tends to get walloped with sticks a lot by, you know, dog walkers that don't like them very much. So I would say, normally I would say, go to the north, go to the southwest coastlands, go to Wales. There is one really good place in this neck of the woods. As I say, Oxfordshire's a wasteland. They're probably extinct. But a good place, the place I did my telemetry studies was around Greenham Common, the old American air base down in Berkshire near Newbury. So because it was a nuclear base and because it had a foreign power building a fence around it for the best part of a century, it kept the people out. And so for all, you know, all the consternation about what the site was actually used for, it was a brilliant place to be a woodlark or a Dartford warbler or an adder for a very, very long time. And then, of course, when the fences were taken away 20 odd years ago, it brought back in the dog walkers, the mountain bikers, the horse riders. So there's real competition now for usage. But and I think in the long term, that doesn't spell good news for the adders. But for the time being, there are at least 10 or 12 different colonies around the edge of the air base. And we know from the telemetry work we did that they do occasionally strike out and meet each other. So I know one really good spot where I can drop out of the car in, you know, not brilliant weather conditions and guarantee half a dozen adders, probably twice as many grass snakes and a handful of slow worms. So, you know, if anyone's super keen, we could maybe one day arrange a small mission to my special magic herping spot. But if you look around the commons and the heathland areas there, you'll find them.
Fantastic. You might have quite a few takers there. Just time for a couple of questions around sort of diet various ways, actually, from Flora and Childbreed. Does anything eat slow worms or grass snakes? And then Angie, what do they eat?
Yes, I mean, slow worms do fall prey to those kind of animals that rootle about and dig things up. So badgers will take them, moles will take them when they come across them, but because of their lifestyle, if they keep their heads down, if you like, and survive past that kind of neonatal stage, they've got a very good chance of living to really old ages. Domestic cats are a problem for them these days, and there's growing evidence that pheasants, you know, the massive releases of pheasants into the countryside is having a huge problem for our native reptiles. Slow worms are more secretive, more hard to find, but if you're basking out in the open, or if a pheasant or a cat sees your movement, or you're a common lizard and you're sitting there, or even an adder, then you are a sitting duck, something like a pheasant. animals that bask more openly, like grass snakes and the other lizard species in adders, tend to get taken by raptors as well. So buzzards and kestrels and things will eat snakes. Same for the grass snake, really. They're hard to catch, very difficult to catch up with. So it's usually kind of birds, and nowadays cats and stuff tends to take them. In terms of what they eat, grass snakes are 90% amphibian eaters. So frogs, toads, newts. And they're interesting. In some parts of the country, they don't accept toads because of their distasteful skin secretions. Other populations seem to eat them without batting an eyelid. But for the nuances of it, they're amphibian eaters. The occasional fish, but it's amphibians or nothing for grass snakes. Slow worms will eat pretty much anything that's sort of small and soft-bodied. So small spiders, leather jackets. Their absolute favourite prey is those small white slugs. I can never remember the genus, but the ones that you find all over your allotment and your garden. So given the opportunity, they'd eat those all day long. So they're really good things to have around vegetable patches and allotments. And
fantastic.
Just generally.
Brilliant. I'm very conscious of the time and the desire to keep the talk tiny. And so I think I'll just close there, but ask you, Neil, I think there's a potential possibility of helping to survey the fish ponds. Do you want to say a little bit about that, and then I can just post in the chat the email address to contact if they're interested.
Sure. Well, we did surveys of the churchyard and then the peace oak as well, and I was a bit disappointed we didn't turn up a grass snake. I didn't think we'd find many, but I thought it wasn't beyond possibility that we'd find one, especially in the churchyard area. And I should have said in both cases, there is a methodology. You don't just randomly go putting tins down and looking for slow worms. There is a certain density per hectare. There are certain ways to lay them out. And then you need to go in certain temperature and weather and wind conditions. And if you do all that, there is a metric that will give you a rough idea whether you've got a small population, a medium one, or a big thriving one. Both of them, to me, seem to reveal that they're kind of modest populations in both. So not big, not small, and certainly in the churchyard, they're restricted to the areas that aren't managed as much. So there's big, open, frequently mown areas. We didn't find any lizards around the edges of the wall, and the more kind of rank areas we did. So it was really interesting. It's fun to do. You get to see some really unusual animals that you wouldn't normally. So we thought, a really interesting place to do would be the fish ponds. Of course, that has got standing water and potential food for grass snakes, much better habitat overall. So I'll be surprised if we don't find a few good grass snakes there. There is the possibility that they will be very infrequent because, of course, the village has almost a ring road, doesn't it? So that beyond the fish ponds, there's that kind of road which runs around before you get to the floodplain of the river. So that will be a barrier. But then they will go up and down the Chilbridge stream. So it'll be interesting. So we'll probably turn our attention to setting that up in maybe the next 2 or 3 weeks. Ideally, if you can get them done about this time of year or in the next couple of weeks, it gives your survey refuges a chance to sort of bed in and the animals to find them. So we'll have to have a chat with Kevin and Katrina and work something out. But when we get that up and running, any interested volunteers, that'd be great. And we did talk last year about if we could perhaps do another training session about how to find slow worms. People with big gardens or people living adjacent to a bit of rough grassland might want to try and see. I mean, it'd be great, wouldn't it, to sort of map where these things are across the parish over a period of time.
Fantastic. Just a reminder on that, if you are interested in joining that, email Eynsham Nature. I've just put it in the chat, eynsham@gmail.com. And I think Sue Osborne, should Sue Osborne be emailed as well, Kevin? Yep. So either Eynsham Nature or Sue Osborne on the parish council, and then we can be on this for arranging that. And the close of another fantastic tiny talk. I just love these so much. I just love them. Thank you so much, Neil, for all of your knowledge. Tomorrow is, help me out, someone.
Steve Chapman, 50 years
on the illustrious history of protecting nature in Eynsham. So tune in at 7:30 again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.